Hi there, welcome to Tech Talks. I'm Liz Hardie and I'm joined today with John Chew, and we're both from the ICANN Technical Services team. So we are doing a series of Tech Talks covering the questions we were asked on the end of tax year planning webinar, and there were a lot of them, so we split this into a few separate sessions. Today we're going to cover the reforms bringing pensions into the IHT net, and we're going to sort of lead on from our last Tech Talks where we covered taking PCLS or tax-free cash and using that between now and April 2027. So that's all very well, but what about the other 75% of the fund? So essentially what we've been looking at is potentially using the normal expenditure from income exemption to help with taking the money out of drawdown and then putting it into trust. So what I'll do first of all is just give you a brief overview of what the normal expenditure out of income exemption is, and then I'll pass over to John who will talk to us about a solution. So essentially it's a really valuable exemption that's quite often overlooked, but I do believe that, you know, given that pensions are going to be becoming part of the IHT net, it is going to be a far more used exemption in the future. Essentially, what you would have to do is you would generally have a regular pattern of gifting. So it would have to sort of be over a period of, say, 3 to 4 years, potentially. And to use it, it must be income that is used. So you couldn't, for example, use the 5% withdrawals from a bond because that's seen as a return of capital, but you can actually use drawdown income. HMRC have actually confirmed that with another of our competitors, that actually the tax-free cash element and the drawdown element is classed as income for that purpose. Another point with the normal expenditure out of income exemption is that it shouldn't be detrimental to the client's lifestyle. So essentially, can they afford to make those gifts out of their surplus income and still enjoy the lifestyle that they've been accustomed to without eating into their capital, essentially? So, John, just over to you in terms of sort of ideas around the remaining pension fund. Could you cover that for us, please?
Absolutely, Liz. And I think, you know, the normal expenditure out of income is a really important area for advisors to understand and just to see whether it's appropriate for their clients. Typically, you might well have come across this in the use of, say, just life policies. So if you're doing a whole of life policy and it might be more than 3,600 annual premium, you probably would have tried to lean into this particular exemption to take advantage of that point. Now, it is very appropriate to consider that when it comes to pension planning. Now, the one thing I always say when I talk to advisors around this area is clearly we are starting to border onto the area of tax. So working with a tax specialist or an accountant typically is always very important part of that thing. Another guide I would tend to suggest is look at IHT Form 403, page 8, I think is probably the best one to consider. And this is where it kind of demonstrates the kind of things that the HMRC are looking for from an income and expenditure perspective. And it's a really helpful tool for just setting out and identifying what the income was, what the expenditure is, and therefore what the excess income is. It's a great way of demonstrating. It's something that personal reps would need to demonstrate as part of the process anyway. So how do we then apply that into a situation? Now, in order to do this, we need to try and create a particular position. So ultimately, there's a case study that, again, your account manager can quite happily take you through. And this is where we compare a traditional process where perhaps a client has said, look, I don't really need this pension pot. It was maybe part of passing on to the next generation. So what do we do around that? Because ultimately, if we leave it in the pension pot, that is going to grow, and that continues to grow until death occurs. And the problem with that process is that, guess what? The IHT bill is getting bigger as the fund grows. No real probably shocker there to anybody who understands that concept. But what it can lead to is a situation where fundamentally the fund, after deduction of any appropriate inheritance tax, could be less than the fund that you actually started with, which kind of feels not right in the hands of the beneficiaries. So clearly that's the motivator to think about, okay, what's the option? And this is where the use of the exemption of expenditure out over and above that of income comes into play. So there's probably two processes around this area we could consider. The first leans a bit into what we discussed in the previous tech talk, i.e. by taking the tax-free cash out and let's say utilizing the bond and trust route. So that takes care of 25% of the fund. So we know that can be very tax efficient from both an IHT perspective and an income tax perspective. Say, for example, if we're using a wealth preservation account or a DGT as part of those two elements. But of course, the remaining fund needs to be withdrawn. Now, this raises the next question, which is, well, actually, if I withdraw money from the pension, aren't I paying tax? And the answer is yes. But what is the long-term benefit? Now, if we can use the exemption out of income, expenditure out of income example, the advantage is by using that, we don't have a 7-year clock. So every withdrawal that I make, yes, is subject to income tax at the marginal rate. So you might have some at basic and some at higher rate, for example, trying to avoid that move of between 100 and 125, where we know the effective tax rate between that 100 and 125 60%. So keeping it ideally in that range then allows us to make a withdrawal. And whilst it still suffers tax, of course, that can then go into an appropriate vehicle. So maybe another, topping up a regular premium bond, for example, and holding that maybe in a gift trust for perhaps the next generation, for the grandchildren, for example. Now, because that's not creating the 7-year clock, that's immediately outside the estate. So what we fundamentally get is we have this tax-free cash pot that's in a bond and trust that's growing. And of course, that's outside the estate after 7 years. And every withdrawal that we're making from the pension pot is going into this maybe bond that's being topped up annually. We don't have the 7-year clock on there. And of course, that's outside the estate because there is no 7-year clock. And of course, what you then have is a combination of two kind of pots together that when death eventually occurs, because that's what life is all about, then those pots are available to the next generation. And again, going back to the point, they can draw on it and only bring it into their estate when they're actually going to spend it. So again, it doesn't form part of their estate until they draw upon it. So again, it's a very, very efficient way of moving, if you like, the remaining 75%. And in the example that we quote, it takes around about 7 years. Now, that won't be the case in every scenario, obviously, but again, it gives a talking point, a discussion point. Now, the other side of that, of course, is should I consider actually doing this process with the tax-free cash? And again, in the example that we utilize, we do look at that as an alternative. It takes slightly longer But of course, we do get some of the withdrawal as tax-free cash, i.e. not subject to income tax. So we're looking at the remaining pot to be subject to the marginal rates going through 20, 40, etc. So again, that is a very useful strategy. In both of those latter two, the remaining fund that the beneficiaries get is larger than the starting point. When you take a pension pot and you just allow it to grow and then subject that to IHT, because that money is always in the estate, that therefore means that the position is not as attractive. Now, I accept in this process you are paying tax as you go. So just a quick thought here, if you are going to make a withdrawal, because the way that the system operates, it's a month one operation. So maybe make a minor withdrawal at the beginning. That will then allow the system to set into what I would call a 12-month scenario. So you get a slightly higher rate of tax applied to the first premium, so maybe £10 or £100. And then the major element of your withdrawals using this exemption will then be subject to what I would call the normal approach to taxation. The tax code is embedded into that system with the provider. Now, there is one final way you could potentially consider doing withdrawals from a pension pot, and this might be by using third-party contributions. This is a useful tool because in essence what you're trying to do is you're moving maybe one money from one pension pot. Again, you will suffer taxation on the withdrawal, but again, putting that into, say, your children or grandchildren's pension pots allows for the contributions to receive tax relief. And of course, if you have an ideal scenario where perhaps the client is a 40% taxpayer and the beneficiaries are both 40% taxpayers, you could actually get to a position where whilst the withdrawal is suffering suffering income tax on it, because of the nature of the tax reclaim, you could well get to a neutral position from an HMRC tax perspective. So again, that is something that's worthwhile considering. But of course, the problem with that is that all you've done is shifted the problem from your clients that's sitting in front of you today to the children, because of course their pension pots are increasing as well, and therefore potentially subject to, guess what, income tax, IHT, and then income tax for the next generation. Mm-hmm. So again, maybe that's a delayed strategy. Again, it all depends on the scenario that your clients are facing. So yeah, that's probably what I would like to just talk around there. Is there kind of any other thoughts you might have in this particular area, Liz?
No, I think you've covered that pretty well, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, from that perspective. So I mean, essentially, you know, if you are paying into your children's pensions, then it's a good idea to do that. But do remember that you are just sort of kicking the can down the road, as it were, because that is going to form part of their IHT estates going forward, isn't it?
Indeed.
So, yeah. Okay, so I think from that point of view, we can round off this Tech Talks. Thanks very much, John. That's been really informative. Thanks very much. So, and that will conclude now our series of pensions and IHT Tech Talks. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope that you found them useful.